All right, hello AP World. Today we're going to be talking about the Mongols. We are still in period 3, although we are almost finished. The Mongols have a very complex history. We tend to look at it more from the perspective of destruction because they were known for conquering wide arrays of area, leaving destruction, chaos in their wake, slaughtering thousands of people, soldiers and civilians alike. So they were violent people, there's no denying that. But at the same time, they also introduce a long period of constant contact between the East and the West. So the long-term effect of the Mongol Empire, since it was so big, is that there's an increased interest in the exchange of goods and ideas between East and West. During the medieval era, some of those connections experienced decay. But with the Mongol invasions and their expansion, there's more of an interest between these two worlds, and that only continues as we move forward in history. And in some ways, we could even connect this exchange to the Renaissance. So in any case, we just really have to emphasize that, and I'll be really talking about some of the more paradoxical elements of the Mongols as we go through. But let's look at the violent opinion first. So let's get a stimulus here. We all know the fun stimuli of the multiple choice and the document-based questions. So this comes from Matthew Paris, who was a Benedictine monk who lived in England. All right, so let's think about point of view there. So this is what he says, and he's writing about the Mongols here. 1240 CE. Swarming like locusts over the face of the earth, they have brought terrible devastation to the eastern parts, laying it waste with fire and carnage. After having passed through the land of the Saracens, they razed cities, cut down forests, overthrown fortresses, pulled up vines, destroyed gardens, killed townspeople and peasants. So this account of the Mongols obviously is not a favorable one. That's clear. But what's more interesting is where this man is writing. As I said earlier, this man is writing this from England. And the Mongols never reached England. They never came close. The farthest west they went was around where Hungary is, so pretty far east in Europe still. But yet the Mongols' reputation had reached so far and wide that this monk, who already in a monastery was living in isolation, he picked up on the Mongols' violence and wrote about it, and this has been preserved through the ages. So that gives you a sense of how terrifying the Mongols were and how far-reaching their effect was. So who were the Mongols? First off, where were they originally from? So they were from north of the Gobi Desert, so in eastern Central Asia. And this land is very flat. It is not fertile. Grasslands, basically. So that's one of the major reasons why the Mongols rely on horses so much. They need to be able to travel over vast expanses of land to follow their food supply. And horses grazed on these grasslands. So Mongols typically were pastoral nomads. And they herded goats and sheep, so they did still domesticate animals. But they were also hunters and foragers. And their society, in terms of gender, was more egalitarian than the average Western society for the time, because everyone, male or female, was first off expected to become a very skilled horseback rider. And both male and female had to be skilled in hunting and warfare. Part of the reason why it was so important for Mongols to have these skills was because they were surrounded by other tribes, so they had to be able to defend themselves. The Tatars were near them, the Naimans, the Merkits, and also the powerful Jurchen in northern China, and we'll look at some maps of some of the surrounding regions in just a moment. The Mongols, because of their location, they wanted the wealth of tribes and kingdoms that were located close to the Silk Roads. And they wanted to have easier access to luxury goods like silk and gold. Earlier Mongols dressed very plainly. They wore long robes and pants made of pelts, and they really didn't possess anything except for a yurt. And a yurt is a Mongolian tent. They could be much larger than this. There are many modern reproductions of yurts. If you ever are traveling to Mongolia, you will probably see them. And they can be much larger. But in general, the point is that if your only possession is a yurt, then you can easily pick up and move everything. They, of course, had horses as well, and they had basic hunting and herding tools. But the point was that they were not a very materialistic society. And along with that, it was very uncommon for Mongolian families to have more than one child at a time because they were constantly on the move. The Mongols also frequently allied with surrounding people, including the Turkish, but they rarely arranged large empires until the 13th century. So that's another important thing to realize is that the Mongolian people were around before this era, but they had never risen to such prominence. And the Mongolian peak only lasts about 100 years. So they have this very monumental impact on society, but this empire is short. It's quite short. And there are other limits to the Mongolian expansion. In particular, they don't spread religion, they don't spread language. What they do is they spread things and ideas. So the Mongolian Empire was founded and centralized under Genghis or Chinggis Khan. And this is a pretty cartoonish image of him, quite frankly, of others. So his name was Temujin before he took the title Chinggis Khan. And you also may see Genghis Khan spelled with a G. He was born in 1162 CE, and he was left on his own at a fairly young age because his father was killed in battle. And Temujin himself was almost imprisoned, but he escaped. So that shaped his character. He allied with prominent Mongol clan leaders during the late 12th century and then eventually rose to power because he was a very ruthless leader. He even killed his own stepbrother to make sure he did not get into the way of his ascent to power. He also, when choosing his bureaucrats, appointed, on occasion, non-family members instead of family members. So this is important because you see that he's much more focused on just power than nepotism and honoring tradition. And he was also a skilled diplomat. He understood how important political alliances were. So one example is that he married off one of his sons to the daughter of a neighboring Khan. And Khan, by the way, is the title of Mongolian rulers. He also engaged in a series of successful alliances that paved the way to him becoming the great Khan that he was. So he was not always a Khan, right? He was previously Temujin. So how did he become Chinggis Khan? Well, essentially it was his mastery in diplomatic skills that got him there. So in 1206, all these surrounding Mongol tribes organized into a confederation that was called a Kuriltai. I may be pronouncing that wrong. And that was an assembly of Mongol leaders. And together in this meeting, they proclaimed him Chinggis Khan, which means universal ruler. So after that, we start to see more political organization among the Mongols. So this really marks the beginning of the Mongolian Empire that we're focusing on. So Genghis Khan did not trust the previous Mongol tribal organization. So instead, he basically broke up these previous alliances. So when men were of fighting age and they were recruited to the military, he made sure that they joined units that did not have tribal affiliation. So basically, you started the military with a clean slate. He also hired military leaders based on talent instead of their tribal connections. And Also, Chinggis Khan was a clear military leader because he did not sit in the capital. He spent most of his reign on horseback, moving around. He actually did not establish a capital. That did not happen until his successors. And the capital of the Mongolian Empire was Karakorum, which is in present-day Mongolia. So you see it right here. And the capital eventually, once it's established, demonstrated an unprecedented source of Mongolian authority. But again, up until the point of Chinggis Khan's death, this capital did not yet exist. And that really shows you that he still, even though he's a very ruthless, power-hungry person, he was not interested in ruling, he was interested in conquering. And also what's really interesting about the Mongols is despite how far their empire reaches, as you can see on this map, their peak population is only about 1 million people. And so by contrast, the population of China at this point, if we include the Song dynasty and also the northern Jin dynasty, was getting close to about 100 million people at this point. And remember that the Mongolians conquered and ruled China at one point. So can you imagine 1% of a population conquering another empire? In other words, you conquer an empire that's 100 times your size. It's just kind of insane to think about. And within that fact, about 1/10 of that population, of that 1 million, was in the military itself. So it's a very militaristic society. So with that said, their military leaders and also just regular soldiers had to have equestrian skills. In other words, they had to be talented on horseback. They were expert archers. They had short bows that could fire very long distances. And the advantage to being on horseback is they could travel a very long distance, typically over 100 kilometers a day. And their fighting tactics were ruthless. They would, when they would conquer a village, they would spare talented workers like artisans or military workers if the enemy surrendered, but they would viciously slaughter a town if they gave any resistance. And what's interesting is that as the reputation of the Mongols reaches farther and farther away, towns, a lot of times when they found out that Mongols were coming, would just immediately surrender because they knew that they stood no chance against the Mongols. The Mongols had a very efficient messenger service, which allowed them to communicate across their very large empire. There were couriers who occasionally they would travel such long distances that they wouldn't even stop to sleep. And Chinggis Khan's frequent campaigns helped ensure that no other nomadic leader would challenge his rule. So basically the fact that he was always on the move made it so that he was the supreme military leader of all of Eurasia. So, of course, the Mongols, with that military leadership, expand rapidly. And we're going to go into detail in just a minute. But one of the reasons why they need to expand is because they need to have as much graze land for their horses and as much hunting land as they possibly can. And Eurasia is a massive continent, so they just spread. Also, Genghis Khan was the first of the Khans to actually consolidate some power, right, and start to unify the Mongolian tribes. So because of that, he wanted to keep them intact. He wanted to keep them a unified empire. Otherwise, local rule might start to take back over. And so by going to war, that gave the entire empire a common mission. So it kept them together. And he also, like I said earlier, he needed resources. So horse grazing land, grass, these are resources. But again, they're not trying to necessarily conquer all this land. A lot of times they just would move in on a territory and have the local rulers that they conquered just pay them tribute and then rule locally as usual. And the Mongolians first set their sights on China, so let's go there now. When the Mongolians started going after China, Chinggis Khan was still alive. He began invading northern China in 1211. And at this point, remember when we studied the Song dynasty, that the Song dynasty was located farther south, right? At this point, the Mongolians are already starting to push the Song farther south as a defensive tactic. At this point, northern China was not ruled by the typical Chinese, they were ruled by people that were called Jurchen, and their dynasty was called the Jin dynasty. So in any case, the first step of the Mongolian quest of China was to conquer this Jin dynasty, but this is not the Song dynasty, not yet. In 1215, they established their capital, and this is very close to Beijing. In fact, the imperial city in Beijing was actually used by Kublai Khan, or the Forbidden City, rather. And after Kublai Khan moves in on the Jin dynasty, they keep moving farther south, and their sights are set on the Song dynasty. And we'll talk about their conquest of the Song dynasty in just a moment. But let's actually shift over to Persia, because that's where they go next. They actually don't conquer the Song immediately. They go for Persia. So same reason, they're also interested in Persia because these lands here in Central Asia are very flat, perfect pastoral landscape. So after they successfully conquer northern China, Chinggis Khan launches his second campaign, and this one is in present-day Afghanistan, and also he is in present-day Iran, so at this point it was Persia. And in Persia, there was a Shah that previously refused to open up trade networks for the Mongols. So the Mongols, when they conquered Persia, were particularly ruthless. The Khan also was not open to having any sort of diplomatic relationships with the Khan. So Chinggis Khan, when he went after the Persians, he went after them hard. They wrought destruction throughout the Shah's state because they wanted to make sure that there was no possibility that the Shah could return to power. So Chinggis Khan destroyed multiple cities, and he slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people in the process. And then to make sure that they didn't come back, he destroyed their irrigation systems. They were the Khanats. If you remember those, I think we talked about those back in period 2, I want to say. But the Khanats were the underground irrigation system that also the Mongols destroyed to make sure they couldn't make enough food. So pretty ruthless there. The Pax Mongolica was a period that really began in earnest after Chinggis Khan died in 1227. So Chinggis Khan ruled more, as we said, as a conqueror, not as an administrator. So he did not really centralize the government or create any kind of bureaucracy. That came later. So after his death, that's when that starts. So we refer to this period basically until 1294 or so, when the Mongols begin to decline. This is called the Pax Mongolia. So if you remember, we've had previous periods that have had Latin titles, the Pax Romana and the Pax Sinica, which were taking place at the same time. So the Pax Mongolica title is coming, it's a direct nod back to those time periods, right? So this also shows you that once the Mongols establish power, they actually bring a lot of stability and order to regions. So it's an important paradox that we have to address, right? That the typical picture of Mongols is that they are these brutal, ruthless warriors, which is true, but at the same time, they do bring progress to a region after they've conquered and stabilized it. So in any case, the Pax Mongolica was characterized as a time of pretty good living conditions for those that lived in Mongol-controlled areas. There was religious tolerance, and the solid military presence of Mongolians protected the Silk Road, which made trade safer, so it was also a very prosperous time. And again, like I said earlier, even those who were attacked by Mongols, those survivors experienced a resurgence of trade because of the Mongols. And the Pax Mongolica was a period of prosperity that was actually comparable to Rome and the Han Dynasty, even though it's much more brief. So there were typically Mongol overlords demanding tributes from local administrators. So what that means is the Mongolians often did not directly rule the people that they conquered. They would basically let local rulers stay in place and do things as usual, but then just pay tribute to the Mongols for their military protection, which also ensured that the people that were conquered by the Mongols did not really experience a major disruption to their typical way of life. After Genghis Khan dies, he splits up, or his empire is split. And this marks an interesting period for the Mongols because each Khanate is different. The most powerful Khanate would be the one in China, the Khanate of the Great Khan, or Kublai Khan. We're going to focus on him quite a bit, but we will talk about what was happening in the other Khans. So the four Khans also, even though they were all descendants of Genghis Khan, were not always getting along well. So there were occasional conflicts between them. And of course, this fractioning of the Mongols leads to its eventual decline. So Kublai Khan is the grandson of Chinggis Khan. So he's actually not immediately Khan after Genghis Khan. There's a period afterwards, but Genghis Khan's son was not a particularly strong military leader. But once we get to Kublai Khan, we see that he really gets the reputation. He is seen as the strongest of Chinggis Khan's ancestors, mainly because he is just as ruthless militarily as Chinggis Khan was. But also because under Kublai Khan's leadership, there is a flourishing of culture throughout his empire. He was a promoter of religious tolerance. He supported the spread of Buddhism and Taoism and Christianity and Islam within his empire. So also he was open to outsiders. In fact, the bureaucracy was only ruled by foreigners. And one of the most famous examples of that is that Marco Polo lives for almost 2 decades in China. And Kublai Khan is given the nickname the Great Khan, even though he was still experiencing conflicts with the other Khans. In many ways, he is seen as the true successor to Chinggis Khan's rule. And the Mongolian kingdom reaches its height in the 13th century, largely due to Chinggis Khan's influence over his region specifically. When Kublai Khan is ruling China, they start to move south. So the Chinese were more formidable enemies when compared to the challenges from other empires. So the Song dynasty proved to be strong in that respect. It took over 35 years for the Mongols to defeat them. And the Mongol dynasty in China was called the Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N, and that officially starts in 1279 CE and it lasts until 1368 CE. And it was called a dynasty, which is interesting because all the other Mongol rules were called khanates. So in this way, Kublai Khan was continuing some Chinese traditions. But in a lot of other ways, we're going to see that Mongol rule in China discourages the continuation of Chinese culture. So he does try to go beyond China, but he's not very successful. So when he gets into Vietnam, the lands are very humid, and it was not the best place to bring horses. And also the people who were defending these lands, notably in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, they used guerrilla tactics to ward off these invasions, and they were very effective, much more so than the typical way that the Chinese fought. And they also attempted to raid the Japanese twice, and they both failed due to typhoons. So the Mongols, once they spread to China, do bring prosperity to the region because of cultural exchanges and improved trade with other countries, including European ones. For example, the playwright Wang Shifu wrote the play The Romance of the West Chamber, which was a love story. And the Mongols, when they ruled China, which is the general rule of thumb, it's ironic that it was called a dynasty because in all respects, the way they ruled, they were trying to subvert Chinese culture. If you think about it, that's the only way they could do it because there were so many more Chinese people than there were Mongols. Remember, only about 1 million Mongols and more like 100 million Chinese. They had to subvert Chinese culture in order to control them. So they were very harsh when they interacted with their Chinese subjects when compared to their rule in Persia, for example. They outlawed intermarriage between the Mongols and the Chinese, for example, and the Chinese were not allowed to learn to speak Mongolian. And their initial plan was actually to eliminate the Chinese population altogether and to use China for pasture land. But eventually there's more moderate leadership that emerges, and they decide just to take advantage of the Chinese population instead of get rid of them completely. And the way that they ruled such a wide area was they had a bureaucracy, but they refused to appoint Chinese people to the bureaucracy. So the Yuan dynasty had foreign leaders. In fact, Marco Polo was one of them. And the attempt was to eliminate all Chinese cultural traditions, including getting rid of Confucian teachings and the civil service exam. So in a lot of ways, the Yuan dynasty was, again, despite the name dynasty, a complete 180 from the kind of government that China normally had. The Mongols were not openly violent towards Confucian people, but they didn't support Confucianism, so it did start to decline in popularity. But despite their feelings about Confucian people, they were religiously tolerant. So they did allow temples and shrines to be built, and the government even subsidized the construction of these structures. And the Mongols believed in multi-marriage, and Kublai Khan actually married, one of his wives was Christian. And more so, many Mongols converted to Buddhism. The majority of Mongols maintained shamanistic traditions, but Buddhist teachings spread to Mongolia, and then it spread to the Tibetan region as well. And the Mongolian Buddhism was similar to shamanism, so they still had respect for supernatural powers and magic. The Buddhists in the region recognize the Khan as an incarnation of the Buddha. So there are differences in the ways that the Mongols practice Buddhism. Again, like I mentioned before, the epitome of this outside perspective of the Mongolians, the fact that they're changing China so dramatically, is with Marco Polo. So Marco Polo visits China in the 13th century. He lives there for 17 years. And he serves for the government of the Yuan dynasty. And when Marco Polo comes back, he writes extensively about his experiences. And despite these writings, many Europeans did not believe his descriptions of China's size and wealth and wonders. But further exploration on the Silk Road helped confirm Marco Polo's accounts. And one of the things Marco Polo's voyage does is it really increases the foreign interest in the Far East. And in many ways, that's a foreshadowing of the Renaissance. So I think I've talked way too long this time. Let's take a break and we'll pick up with Mongolian rule in Russia. So stay tuned and thanks.